Hey folks, this is week 4 of Foundations of Business Management 501 in the MBA program. Again, this course, the intent of this course is to introduce non-business majors to the business model, to business concepts, seminal thinking, vocabulary, and from a pretty high view, 10,000 foot view, the functional areas of an organization. So the purpose of this short video review, at least at week 4, is to review those concepts, talk about where we've gone and where we're going, and then hopefully define some vocabulary terms that maybe we haven't totally addressed so far, or at least are still a little unclear for you. So, big picture, the purpose of an organization, of a business, profit or not for profit, is to serve the needs, unfulfilled or fulfilled in a different way, wants and needs of a market at a profit. And the key to that sentence is at a profit, because if you can't make money, even nonprofits must make money to put back into the organization. If you can't make money at what you're doing, it really will never serve the purpose, because that is that model is not sustainable. So we have to recognize, and I think the word has been unfortunately abused by some and misinterpreted by others, but the word profit is not a bad word. It is a recognition that the market views whatever you're selling, product or service, or whatever you're offering for a price that they're willing to exchange for, that there's value in it. That is called the value proposition. And that value proposition, of course, takes into account the costs and the expenses of running the organization, and in addition, some extra, called the markup or margin, which is what ultimately your profit is, if again the market agrees with the value proposition. For a long time, there was an organization that you're familiar with called Blockbuster. People were very comfortable with their business model, the way they did their economics. People were willing to take time out of their day, drive to some mall or strip mall, likely on a busy street with a large parking lot, and walk around this store looking for a video in hopes that they'd find something they'd like. They'd pay a fee for it, and if they didn't bring it back, I can't remember, whatever it is, 24, 48 hours, totally rewound. For some of you younger people in the class, you have no idea what I'm talking about. You wouldn't get charged more, but if it was late or wasn't rewound, then you would get charged more, and then they moved on to DVDs. And eventually, their economic business model, their value proposition, stopped becoming valuable to the market. They had other alternatives that they were willing to give up money for a similar service, and obviously Netflix is the example that, Redbox and then Netflix was the example that really was the beginning and the end for Blockbuster. So all organizations need to make money. They make money by charging a price that covers their costs and expenses, and then more that the market views as valuable enough for them to exchange what is our exchange, and our exchange system is money. If there's enough people that do that consistently, then we have a business model that is sustainable. If there are not enough people, just a few people that are willing to do that, then likely you will not have enough to cover your costs and your expenses, and you will eventually go out of business. So operating a business actually is not an easy endeavor. It takes something special to happen. That's why about 70-75% of businesses fail within the first 2 to 3 years of operations, because they cannot get their business model to work in a competitive economic environment. So, how a business makes money really is up to the functional areas of a business, which is what this course is introducing you to. Management, information technology, IT, HR, human resource, marketing, finance, accounting, sometimes operations. All of those, and perhaps even R&D in a bigger organization, all of those are referred to as the functional area of a business. The functional areas of a business need to work synergistically, together more than separate, in order to push that value proposition along. So at every step that they do internally, it really is working on the value proposition, which is related to the price. And so when we become more efficient and more effective, and we have innovations, we can stream that upstream and downstream to the consumer and then to the firm through, again, our value proposition. And so we've taken a look at, so far up to week 4, how managements organize themselves, sole proprietorship, partnership, corporation, how they want to be led through management, how they want to manage their human resource, and how that might be done using an ethical lens, whether it's the lens of the economic model or the socio-economic model, which we'll touch on here in a little bit. So that's what we've gotten to so far in this course. In addition, we looked at how this operates, how businesses operate in a global marketplace, which is true for basically every organization now. For a small sole proprietorship that's, there's a pizza place here where I live in Trumpelow, Wisconsin. They certainly don't sell their pizza globally, but they likely are in the global environment as part of their value proposition, because my guess is they probably get their pizza boxes or some wrapper, tin foil, or some type of something they use in the production of the pizzas that comes outside the United States border. So the recognition here is that all business is global in nature, and those forces are requiring businesses to become aware of that in what's called the external environment. So how a business or an organization reacts to the external environment, because they can't change it, is pretty important. The variables of the external environment are demographic change, societal change, economic change, competitive change, legal regulatory change, political change. All of those things are working and constantly changing in how organizations plan strategically, adapt to those, and react is the difference between being a Blockbuster and a Netflix. Of course, Netflix knew strategically that just offering streaming services wasn't enough, and now they're actually producing their own content, which is very popular. And so there's examples of companies that are doing that. We also looked at the constant need to be innovative, or what we call disruptive innovation, which can be small or big, but that notion of always checking, researching, testing the business model in terms of the proposition, the value proposition, and if that is still valid within the marketplace, is absolutely something that our organizations have to do. And so that's where we've been kind of up to this point. Where we will go is looking at next marketing, which really is in charge of communicating the value proposition. So marketing is creating, communicating, and delivering a message of value. They have a toolbox to do that, which we'll talk about next week. And then finally, the last section that we're done in week 6 before you write your paper in week 7 is the notion of the importance of understanding the basics of finance and accounting. A profit and loss statement, an income statement, which is the same thing, balance sheet, margins, break-even points, all of those, no matter what your job is, but now as an MBA student, are going to be pretty important part of your new vocabulary, and kind of what you do when you wake up in the morning as a manager is to make sure that we're always working towards profitability and then growing our profitability by being unique, not by being the lowest price, which is something that we talked about in week 1. So I'm just going to kind of float through some of the chapters here in terms of just looking at some vocabulary terms to make sure that we're on the same page, and I'll define those. We know that some words, so chapter 1, a lot of it was on econ. We know that there are really 2 ways to study economics, micro and macroeconomics, but in totality, economics is the study of how either individuals, organizations, or countries manage their scarce resources. The scarce resources being labor, capital, natural resources, information, technology. Those are sometimes referred to as our factors of production or our resources, and how those are managed. Economics studies that and tries to find ways to do it better and more efficiently and effectively is what economics really looks at. Microeconomics really looks at the individual firm level in the circular flow of money, which we discussed in week 1. and really spends a lot of time on the laws of supply and demand and how price is associated with that, and finding equilibrium at the cross of supply and demand. And again, organizations need to recognize the laws of supply and demand within a competitive environment when they're trying to figure out how is their business model going to work. Are they going to be a premium-based business, meaning they're going to charge a high margin, a high price, and sell less items? Or are they going to follow the Walmart model and have a lower margin, 2 to 3%, but they're going to do it a lot, and they can still make a lot of money that way? One isn't better than the other. It's just a strategic choice that businesses are making. There's a word that often we hear in business called stakeholders. Stakeholders are those people that have some type of a stake or involvement in the organization, and they can go from employees to owners to suppliers to vendors, same thing, to customers, of course, community members, politicians. All of those actually are all stakeholders, and how an organization views those, and some view them differently than others, can be a differentiator. And that's a word that you likely might not know, maybe you do. And differentiator or differentiation is how you are branding yourself, making yourself different. What is your unique selling proposition relative to the competition? And some differentiate themselves by treating their stakeholders different than others, and they feel that they can hold value on that and use that in the communication to the marketplace. Invisible hand is a word that's used in econ a lot. Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, and that in a free market system, the government should have what's referred to as this invisible hand, or laissez-faire politics, or laissez-faire economics, where there should be little touch or as little touch from government intervention as possible, and let the market make all the decisions. That is what is referred to as a market economy. We don't have that really. We have a mixed economy where there is some government intervention and actually even ownership of the means of production, but by and large, most of it is market driven, and which is different than, of course, a command economy. And a command economy is where individuals have really no choice, and the decisions, the factors of production of what to produce, how to produce, who to produce it for, where, when, are all basically determined by a central government and planning. A couple other words that I'm just looking at here. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the federal government and Congress using the laws that they have available to them to affect the money supply, and that would be through taxing and spending. Monetary policy is the controlling of the money supply from the Federal Reserve, which is not part of the executive branch, but it is a quasi-governmental agency. And monetary policy also can control the money supply through a number of different tools called fractional reserve banking, on how they tell banks how much money they have to keep on hand of their deposits. The biggest tool they use, of course, is setting interest rates through the buying and selling of bonds through something called the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee. So the Federal Reserve is monetary policy and controlling the money supply, i.e. inflation, and the fiscal policy is the federal government controlling the money supply, i.e. inflation, through taxing and spending. A couple real other ones that I'm just seeing here that I want to make sure we're good on because they're talked a lot about is recession. Recession, we know that our business is cyclical, that we have expansion, we have decline, we have a trough, we have recovery and expansion. It kind of goes up and down like a roller coaster. The job of the federal government, and some would argue, and also the Federal Reserve, is to try to flatten that so we don't have so many severe ups and downs. When our economy is mostly measured by something called the GDP, or gross domestic product, what we can output in a time period as measured by 4 variables: consumption, investment meaning capital investment, equipment, buildings, things like that, government spending, and net exports. Those 4 make our GDP. If we have 2 consecutive quarters, so 6 months in totality, in a row of negative growth, economic growth as measured by the GDP as a percentage, then we are in what's called a recession. Once we're in a recession, if we have 2 positive quarters of growth, in other words, something over 0.0, so even 0.1, we would be considered in what's referred to as a recovery. Expanding economies typically have 5, 6, 7, 8% GDP. We have not been expanding for a long time. Some say we've been stagnant for close to 10, 15 years, where our GDP has been up and down but relatively flat. And in this current recovery since 2011, 12, after the recession of 8, we have been expanding at a rate of 1.5%, 2% on average. So it hasn't been great. Moving on to Chapter 2, which is on social responsibility and being ethical. There is a term called caveat emptor, which means buyer beware. Buyer beware is a Latin phrase. Caveat emptor is a Latin phrase meaning buyer beware, and that has always been for a long time the philosophy of how the market operates within our economy. In other words, customers, consumers, the onus is on them, and if you buy something that's not very good or valuable or you got it ripped off, too bad, buyer beware. It's your job. Of course, that was difficult to operate, or it was difficult in practice because really the information was held by those that produced, the businesses, and they were pretty tight on holding on to that information. They told you only what you needed to know when you needed to know it. Because of this lack of information, caveat emptor was the overriding concept for a long time. Fast forward to the early 1990s, we have the technology boom, we have the opening up of markets internationally, and all of a sudden everybody's got information at the tips of their fingers. And all of a sudden it's switched from caveat emptor, buyer beware, to caveat venator, or venator. And that means seller beware. That means the businesses better beware now because the consumer has a lot more power now because they have a lot more information and they're not going to be nearly as loyal as they used to be because of lack of competition. Now we have a ton of competition, not only competitive information, but competitive firms in a global marketplace. So how businesses operate, or at least how they view their relationship with the customers, has and should have and did change to more of a mindset of what's referred to as market orientation, where I'm going to figure out what the consumer wants, when they want it, how they want it, where they want it, and then I'm going to build the mousetrap, and then I'm going to deliver it. The old model was the production orientation, Field of Dreams model. I'm going to build it, and here it is, take it or leave it. And that worked for a lot of businesses because we had little competition. Not so true anymore. Organizations can look at their responsibility to all the stakeholders kind of in two philosophical lenses. One isn't right or wrong, at least I'm not going to tell you that. There's the economic model of social responsibility. So my social responsibility is just to make money. If I don't make money, I can't give people jobs, and they can't take that money and buy other things and live, and the customer won't get what they need if I don't make money. The socio-economic model looks at it a little differently in that we're going to make some money, but we're going to do it in a way that might be a little bit different than just the flat-out make money, follow the laws, and that's about it. Now we're going to make money, of course, follow the laws, but we're going to also take into account all the stakeholders and see if there's something that we can do where there's doing no harm to all, which is more of a Kantian, from Immanuel Kant and Kantiism's view, rather than this utilitarian approach that was advocated by Milton Friedman for a long time. Okay, I'm going to go to chapter 3, which is on exploring global business. If I can find where that is, 93. Some of the terms I'm just going to look at to make sure we have a good understanding is in trade. Well, of course, trade deficit means that a country that has a large trade deficit, like we do, means that we are importing more goods than we're exporting. Now, there's good and bad to that. Depends on what your lens is. You can look at it and say, well, I'm not really upset with that because we're likely importing more goods than we're exporting because we're getting goods and services from other countries that we feel are more valuable, like $5 t-shirts. If they were manufactured in the United States and sold here and shipped here, likely those $5 t-shirts wouldn't be $5. They might be making the number up, $15. And we might not be okay with that. So typically when there are deficits that are negative, sometimes and oftentimes the consumer actually has a bit of an advantage. Again, I'm being pretty basic here, but the consumer sees the value in that because they're largely getting products that are less expensive from other countries, mostly due to low labor. On the other hand, the manufacturers of that country that's importing so much are hurt. And we've seen that, of course, in our country because they're not making as much stuff anymore, and of course those jobs are gone. So there is no perfect answer. We do know, though, that by and large trade does improve the standard of living. And that trade and how it's worked out and how it's implemented is something that is not the purpose of this course. We just need to recognize that there are winners and losers. Tough word. There are advantages and disadvantages to having trade deficits beyond the value of the money issues, which are a little bit more complicated and beyond the point of this course. Chapter 3 again is on exploring global business. Some other words that maybe you might not be familiar with because you just simply weren't a business major is something called comparative advantage and absolute advantage. Comparative advantage means that two countries produce the same good and service. One just happens to do it a little bit better than the other. An absolute advantage means that like we have an absolute advantage over Japan in a bunch of natural resources because we have them and they don't. And it so allows us to trade with them differently than they trading with us. But some countries have an absolute advantage over us relative to labor costs. Some of that's pretty basic. So we'll move on to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is on choosing a form of business ownership. And that's 126. Some of the words we should be familiar with. Sole proprietorship obviously is the single owner. Partnership is one or more owners, and corporation can be broken up into two different segments in terms of how you want to own an organization or a business. You have a publicly traded corporation, which is anybody. If the stock is listed on the stock exchange, one of the exchanges has the ability to participate in the ownership. And a privately held corporation, only those closely held members, typically family, but sometimes employees, have the opportunity. Outsiders cannot. About 70% of all organizations are formed as a sole proprietorship, 80% are corporations, and about 10% are partnerships. A merger happens when one company buys another. Typically, those mergers are done not in a hostile environment, that they're done because the organization or the business believes that they can become more profitable. Usually they're buying something when they merge with someone else because the other company kind of gets bought out. They're buying their customers, they're buying their technology, they're buying their inventory. And then sometimes when the merger happens, jobs are actually reduced in some cases because there's duplication of efforts. You have, let's say, Office Max and Office Depot just merged recently. They both had separate accounting departments. Not anymore. They both had separate human resource departments. Not anymore. They closed some stores where they had double stores. In La Crosse, we had an Office Max and Office Depot. The Office Max is now closed. All those people mostly lost their jobs in the transition. And so mergers, again, can be good and sometimes internally not so good for those that are affected by it. There's a couple words in here in terms of if you're a publicly traded company, a corporation. There's really two types of stock. There's common stock. That's stock that individuals can buy on the New York Stock Exchange. And then there's and they have the ability to profit either if the stock goes up in price or if the company would offer dividends on their profit. You don't have to by law. Some do, some don't. Some have a history of doing it more than others. And then there's something called preferred stock, which is typically more expensive than common stock Anybody can buy that as well, but because it's more expensive, you're paying likely, or usually what you're paying for is almost a guarantee of dividends at a certain rate or a percentage. Board of directors are individuals from outside the company mostly. Usually the CEO, the chief executive officer, and some other executives are part of a board of directors of that company. But then they hire, elect, ask individuals that are executives of other organizations, businesses, to be on their board of directors. They meet regularly during a year to discuss strategy and set strategy and policy of the organization, whether it's a profit or not for profit. In profit situations, usually those board members get compensated and paid, typically with company stock, but sometimes it's monetary as well. There have been some issues with board members and CEOs being a little bit too cozy. A corporate officer is someone who, in again a publicly traded company, is typically an executive, vice president of marketing, vice president of finance, chief operating officer, chief executive officer, chief financial officer, CFO. Those corporate officers are treated differently by the IRS, and because they are in a position of power that has a lot of knowledge, and they could act unethically, they are required to list, and then individuals, the public, can go and look at their salary, how many stock options they have, when they trade it, how many shares they trade. So all public identified officers of publicly traded corporations, if you go to Yahoo Finance and you look at Walmart, you can look at their public officers, and you can look at how much they get paid in salary and then how much they get compensated in stock, and when they trade or not trade their stock or exercise what's called options. Options are shares of stock that corporations, publicly traded corporations and private, compensate their employees with at a certain price. So by example, if you were at Microsoft, you worked there, and at the end of the year you got a bonus of 5,000 shares of Microsoft at an option of $25. That means that you could buy the stock at $25. Let's say it's though currently trading at $30. That's a good deal. You could sell then and make the difference. Sometimes, though, of course, the options are at a price that are higher than what the stock is currently traded at, which isn't good. Moving on. Small business entrepreneurship and franchises, chapter 5. This is getting a little long here, so I'm going to kind of speed this up a little bit. 56. The other thing I was just thinking is a word that is often used is equity. Equity in finance, it's got multiple meanings. You'll find in business that we have multiple meanings for the same word, unfortunately, kind of like the English language. So equity can be used in a number of different ways. Equity really means value or something of worth. So if you have a home equity loan, you're taking a loan on what you own, your personal ownership of that home. So if you have easy numbers here, you have a home that you purchased for $100,000, or let's say, back up. Let's say your house is worth $100,000. That's the market value as by appraisal. You have paid in $20,000 and you still owe the bank on your loan $80,000. So your equity in that home, your financial claim to that is $20,000. So if you're going to take out a home equity loan, you could take out up to, in this case, $20,000. The problem with equity in homes recently is it's been what's called underwater. So same situation, you owe $80,000 on that house, that $100,000 house, but it was just appraised, let's say at the financial downturn, and it's worth $60,000. Whoops. Not only can you not take a home equity loan, you are upside down or underwater up to $20,000 in this case. And that's where a lot of people still are, is they are upside down in their house. They bought their homes at the peak of the market, took a loan with a lot of debt because they could, which wasn't a good idea, neither by the banks or the individual. or the government allowing to do it. So we've got 3 that are kind of naughty here. But took a loan that they likely couldn't afford, lost the job, the market caved, and now they owe way more on their home than it's worth. And it's taking people a long time to get get out of that situation, or they're just walking away in some cases. But I was just thinking about equity. Equity also is a word that is used in finance accounting in terms of what a business is worth. What's their equity? What's their equity stake? And that's usually tied to the number of shares times the stock price. Small businesses, entrepreneurship. I don't think I'm just looking at the words. There's really nothing here that I can see that would be something you would know. The only word I can see that would be venture capital or venture capitalist. That is someone who comes in that has a lot of money and is going to give you some of their capital, money. Capital is a word that means money or value as well. But it can also mean like a capital improvement could be a new factory, assembly line, or a new building is also a capital improvement. But so a venture capitalist is someone that gives their capital to someone's venture. So you're getting funded through what's referred to as private equity. So private equity, private value or worth, you're getting it from a private individual rather than what's called public equity, which is either through the stock market you're getting funded or through a bank through some type of debt lending, which is, of course, a loan. Moving on to Chapter 6 on understanding the management process. Looking for, again, some keywords that we might not know. There's something called SWOT analysis that's one of the management strategic responsibilities. Some of you might be familiar with this, but others might not. SWOT is an acronym that stands for looking at an organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So it's part of the planning process. It's part of strategic planning. Many organizations do this. It's historically been around for a long time. There are other models that are becoming a little bit more popular because the SWOT analysis, which is still done, is limited in its scope of looking at a company's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and of course then planning on how to react to, change, defend, take advantage of those strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats. So SWOT analysis. That's part of the strategic plan. And then once we have a strategic plan, then how we do things is referred to as the tactical plan. So there's a big difference between strategy and tactics. Strategy is the overarching or overriding way of thinking to fulfill the purpose of an organization or the why and make money. Tactics are how you're actually going to go about doing that. So from a marketing perspective, which I teach, billboards, TV commercials, social media, direct mailing, those are all tactics to fulfill a certain marketing strategy, which is to fulfill a organizational level strategy, which is to fulfill organizational mission, vision, and values. Other things in understanding the management process, Chapter 6, that I'm looking at. Total Quality Management, or TQM, has been a production business practice that's been in place now for well over 15 years. It came out of the Japanese automakers, TQM, or Total Quality Management, and it's a strategy, and then that's developed on down to the tactical level on how organizations become more efficient and effective in their operations. We know if we're more efficient, we can drive that value onto the consumer, either by us being more profitable or by us holding the price cost low, or being able to at least hold or maybe even sometimes increase our margins. Nothing else there that I really see. There's a term here called benchmarking. Benchmarking is kind of goal setting for management, and the metrics that we use for benchmarking, at least from the managerial point of view, could be sales, could be margin, could be profitability, could be market share, could be waste, could be reduction in returns, conversions. all of those things are referred to as benchmarking metrics that organizations manage because it's it's part of profitability. Chapter 7 on creating a flexible organization. We know that organizations need to be nimble and ability should be able to change. We don't want to be a big ship in the ocean where it takes a long time to change, especially in this competitive global environment that we've discussed. Organizations that are flat, lean, are easier to change and more rapidly can react to the external environment than vertical organizations that are vertical in nature, meaning top-down. We looked at something called bottom-up actually this week in terms of how we want to structure ourselves and then lead and manage from that. I don't see anything else here that sticks out. Chapter 8, producing quality products. Of course, quality is referred to, or at least is tied to, our value proposition, and how we manage quality can be very academic and tactical. There are things, there are systems in place that help manage quality, and that's what a lot of managers end up doing, is managing the process of quality, either through some are follow the Malcolm Baldrige Award tactics or techniques, and then others follow Six Sigma. If you're any, I don't think we have any trained folks. I mean, we might have one or two in the class, but Train does Six Sigma, and again, these are all developed theories that are now practiced in industry to become quality driven. And again, if we have quality, we have efficiencies. If we have efficiencies, we have better profitability because the market recognizes and wants quality. Utility is a word that I just see here. Utility also is a word, an economic term that means value. Anytime that you can increase the utility of something, you're increasing its value or its worth to the organization. Chapter 9, attracting and retaining the best employees. That's what we're talking about now, is chapters 9 and 10. HR, the human resource department, is one of the functional areas that we've talked to before, who's really in charge of attracting, hiring, and retaining employees. Human resource, in most cases, is the most beneficial, but it's also the most costly investment that an organization has. And I say investment, not an expense, because it really isn't an investment. The ability to do that is becoming much more difficult than it has in the past for a variety of reasons, none of which is a lot of generational change and shift that is happening, while we also have societal and demographic change at the same price. Human resource management also spends a lot of time on the financial side of compensation and coming up with benefits packages. The big thing that I guess I'll just say in general is, and this is kind of goes to the next chapter on motivation, that is, there have been many studies that have validated and confirmed that individuals, when it's all said and done, do not get motivated by money, salary increases. They need a baseline, right? Just like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need the baseline level. But any dollar after whatever that baseline is, and it's different for different people in different jobs, it is not a motivating factor. Autonomy, self-actualization, working for a purpose, working with a team are all motivating factors that make people want to work, transform their work, and continue to work for that company. Actually, there was a study recently that was just conducted that's been widely reported that it appears that about $75,000 is the mark. And any amount after that really is not much of a motivating factor. That in order to be satisfied, satiated as an employee, you need about 75 grand. And again, we're largely talking white-collar professionals here, and blue-collar professionals as well. You need about 75 grand. And any dollar amount after that really is not going to increase the motivational level and output and happiness. Happiness is a key word. Happiness of the individual. And that's one of the things that human resource is really concerned about now, is finding a way to keep great employees because they're looking for purpose in their work. I think that's really kind of some of the key vocabulary words talking through those chapters. I know this is pretty long and many of you will bounce in and out, but hopefully this is helpful in terms of getting a better grasp on all this stuff that's talked about in the reading that you might not be familiar with because you've never been exposed to it, and I know it's new. I will just end it here, and we'll go from there. If you have any questions, please email me or call me. Thanks.